My name is Elias. I am 43 years old, and I am the man who locked the masters inside their own house. Not with chains, no, with silence, with iron, with my own 2 hands, the same hands they paid for, the same hands they thought they owned. They called me property. They called me a tool. They put a number on me like I was livestock at a county fair. But what they never understood, what Thomas Hargrove never understood, is that a man who knows how to build things also knows how to build a prison. And I built the finest one Riverwood, Georgia had ever seen, right under their feet, right under their polished oak floors. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't run. I waited. And then one July night, everything changed. If this already touched something inside you, if you felt that weight in your chest just now, I need you to stay with me. Hit that subscribe button because my family counts on every single person who chooses to listen. Leave a comment below telling me where you're from. Just your city, your state. Let me know you're out there. And if you believe that every human being deserves to be seen, press that like button right now, because this story is just beginning, and what comes next, I promise you, will change the way you see everything. There's something I need you to understand before I go any further. This is not a story about hatred. I want to be clear about that. What I did, what I planned for years in the dark, beside the glow of a forge, came from a place so deep inside me that I still don't have a proper word for it. It came from the morning they pulled my wife, Margaret, away from me on the docks of Charleston, from the sound my youngest boy made when the rope went taut and the cart moved. I carried that sound every single day in Riverwood, every hammer strike, every breath. If you have ever loved someone and had them ripped from your arms like they were nothing, then you already know where this story is going. And I promise you, before it ends, nothing will ever feel the same. Riverwood smelled like red clay and burning pine. That's the first thing I remember every time I close my eyes and go back there. The Georgia sun didn't just shine. It pressed down on you like a hand on the back of your neck, heavy and intentional. The smithy sat at the edge of the main property, maybe 40 yards from the big house, close enough that I could hear the Hargrove children laughing on the porch in the evenings. The forge never truly went cold. Even in winter, there was always a glow coming from inside that shed, orange and breathing, like something alive trapped behind iron bars. The walls were black with years of soot. The floor was packed dirt, hard as stone. That shed was the only place on the entire plantation where I was left mostly alone. And solitude, I learned, is the beginning of all dangerous thinking. My days had a rhythm that looked like obedience from the outside. I rose before the birds. I stoked the forge before the overseer made his first round. By the time the morning light hit the fields, I had already been working for 2 hours, mending plow blades, straightening wheel rims, casting new hinges for the barn doors. I was good at it, exceptionally good, and they knew it. Thomas Hargrove never let them sell me, no matter the offer, because my hands made his operation run smoothly. That gave me something most men in my position never had: time. Time to think, time to observe, time to memorize every creak in that house, every lock on every door, every measurement of every room. I studied Riverwood the way a general studies a battlefield, quietly, completely, without ever letting them see my eyes truly open. But underneath all of that discipline, underneath the routine and the carefully measured silence, there was a wound that never scabbed over. Margaret's face. The way she looked at me that last morning in Charleston, not with fear, not even with tears, but with this expression I can only describe as an apology, like she was sorry for what the world was. Like she was trying to prepare me for the pain before it hit. My boys were 7 and 9 years old. The older one, Samuel, had my father's jaw. The younger one, Daniel, had her eyes. I replayed that doc every night on the dirt floor of the smithy, every single night. And instead of breaking me, and Lord knows it tried, it sharpened me. Grief, when you have nowhere to put it, becomes something else entirely. It becomes architecture. It becomes a plan. It was a Tuesday in March when everything shifted. I remember because the peach trees along the fence line had just begun to blossom, pale pink against a gray sky, almost too delicate for a place that carried so much cruelty. A trader came through Riverwood that morning, a heavy-set man with a red beard and mud on his boots. He and Thomas Hargrove stood on the porch for nearly an hour, talking low, passing papers back and forth. I kept my eyes on the forge, but I listened. The trader had come from Charleston. He had news about a shipment, about families being redistributed to plantations further south, deeper into territory where names disappeared and records didn't follow. He mentioned a woman. He mentioned 2 boys. He gave numbers, not names. But I knew. The temperature of the air around me changed. My hammer came down harder than I intended and split the iron clean in 2. That was the moment the plan stopped being a thought and became a decision. I stood there holding that broken piece of iron, and I made a choice that I understood, even in that moment, would cost me everything. I could endure. I could lower my head, keep the rhythm, survive, the way so many men around me had learned to survive, by becoming smaller and smaller until the pain had less surface to touch. Or I could use every single thing they had taught me, every skill they had cultivated in me for their own profit, and turn it into something they never saw coming. There was no anger in that decision. That surprised me then, and it surprises me still. It was cold. It was architectural. I set the broken iron down on the bench, took a slow breath, and began calculating measurements in my head. I thought about the space beneath the big house. I thought about the crawl space I had helped repair 2 winters before. I thought about how low the clearance was, and I began to build. First in my mind, then in secret, piece by piece in the dark. The consequences of that decision didn't announce themselves all at once. They arrived slowly, the way a river rises, almost imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. I started working longer hours voluntarily, which pleased Hargrove and reduced suspicion. I requested extra iron stock, citing broken equipment, and he approved it without question because I had never given him reason to doubt me. I began making pieces that had no obvious purpose, brackets, hinges, sliding mechanisms, and hiding them beneath the floorboards of the smithy, wrapped in burlap, covered in sawdust. Every piece was precise, every measurement deliberate. I wasn't building a cage out of rage. I was building it the way I built everything else, with patience, with accuracy, with the full weight of my ability. At night I sketched diagrams in ash on the dirt floor, then swept them away before dawn. Riverwood had no idea what was growing inside its own walls. The masters never do. The first real obstacle came in the form of a man named Caldwell. He was the head overseer, thin, pale, with eyes that moved too fast for someone who pretended not to pay attention. He had been watching me for weeks before I noticed. One evening, as I was banking the forge for the night, he appeared in the doorway of the smithy without a sound, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, studying the workbench. He asked me what I was making. I showed him a hinge, a real one, finished, perfectly ordinary. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and set it back down without a word. Then he looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that isn't really about what it appears to be about. He left without speaking. That night I moved every hidden piece deeper under the floorboards and covered the seams with forge ash. I didn't sleep. I lay on my back in the dark and listened to the crickets outside, and understood that the margin for error had just become razor thin. In those sleepless hours, the doubts came. That is something I have never admitted to anyone, and I am admitting it now because I believe the truth deserves to be whole. I questioned everything, not the plan itself. The plan was sound, I knew that with a craftsman's certainty. What I questioned was myself, whether the man I was becoming in that smithy, in that darkness, was still the same man Margaret had loved on the docks of Charleston. Whether Samuel and Daniel, if they could somehow see me, would recognize their father or see a stranger wearing his face. I thought about God. I thought about what Scripture says about vengeance and what it says about justice, and whether those two things can ever occupy the same action. I had no answers. What I had instead was the memory of my youngest boy's eyes, wide and uncomprehending, as the cart pulled away. And that memory, every single time, was enough to carry me through to morning. Then Caldwell started making unannounced visits, every 2 or 3 days, always at different hours, always casual in the way that deliberate things pretend to be casual. He would ask about the workload, inspect finished pieces, sometimes just stand in the doorway watching me work. I responded by becoming a performance. I made myself slower, more visibly tired. Occasionally making small errors I would correct loudly so he could hear my frustration. I gave him a story to believe, a man worn down by labor, nothing more. Meanwhile, I moved the construction entirely to night hours, working by the faintest ember light, never striking metal when the house was quiet enough to carry sound. My hands learned to work almost entirely by touch. The brackets, the sliding bars, the silent latches, all of it built in near total darkness. Caldwell was watching a man repair farm tools. He had no idea he was watching an architect complete his masterpiece. 3 weeks before I was ready, something happened that nearly destroyed everything. A young man named Tobias, 16 years old, field hand, sharp and restless in the way that worried the overseers, saw me returning from beneath the big house at 2 in the morning. I had been installing the final support beams for the crawl space structure, moving through the darkness on my hands and knees, and when I emerged from behind the latticework at the base of the house, he was standing there, just standing, watching. We stared at each other for what felt like a full minute without breathing. I did not threaten him. I did not beg. I simply looked at him with everything I had inside me and said nothing. He looked back at me, this boy, this child who had probably never known a single day without fear, and then he turned around and walked away into the dark. I never spoke to Tobias about it again, but every morning after that I looked for him first, to make sure he was still there, still safe, still silent. The night before I acted, I sat alone beside the dying forge for the last time, and I let myself feel everything I had been compressing for years. The grief came up through my chest like heat rising through iron, slow at first, then overwhelming. I thought about every man and woman on that plantation who had swallowed their dignity every single morning just to survive until evening. I thought about the children born into that system who had never once been told their own worth. And I thought about what I was about to do, and whether it would mean anything at all in the long run, or whether Riverwood would simply replace me with another set of hands and continue breathing as if nothing had happened. The forge ticked and cooled around me. The Georgia night was heavy with the smell of pine and distant rain. I pressed my palms flat against the workbench, the same bench where I had built every piece of what was waiting beneath that house, and I stayed there until my heartbeat slowed to something steady. Then I stood up, and I walked toward the big house for the last time, as a man who had not yet acted. What I discovered in those 2 weeks, the 2 weeks they spent beneath the floor of their own house, was something I had not fully anticipated. I had built that space to teach, to mirror, to force a physical understanding of what dimensions mean when they are imposed on a human body. But what I did not expect was what I would learn watching Thomas Hargrove through those narrow gaps in the oak planks above him. On the 3rd day, he stopped demanding. On the 5th day, he stopped threatening. By the 9th day, he had become something I had never seen in him before, something unguarded and trembling and entirely without performance. He was afraid. Not of me specifically. He was afraid of the dark itself, of the low ceiling, of the stillness. And in that fear I saw, with absolute clarity, that he had never once in his entire life been asked to simply exist without power. He had no self beneath the authority. There was nothing there. That was the most devastating thing I had ever witnessed. That revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about what I had been living inside. I had spent years believing that men like Thomas Hargrove were monsters by nature, that cruelty was something they were born carrying, something essential to who they were. But beneath that floor, stripped of title and command and the machinery of a system built to elevate them, he was just a frightened man in a small space. The monster wasn't Thomas Hargrove. The monster was the architecture around him, the laws, the economy, the language, the silence of good people who looked away. He had simply been handed a role and had never been given a single reason to question it. That didn't absolve him, not even close. Margaret was still gone. My boys were still gone. But understanding the mechanism of evil, seeing it reduced to its bare components beneath my own floorboards, changed something fundamental in the way I carried my anger. It didn't disappear. It clarified. And clarity, I had learned, is far more dangerous than rage. By the 12th day, I faced a choice that no plan, no matter how precise, can fully prepare you for. I had 3 options, and I understood with complete honesty that none of them were good. I could release the Hargroves, disappear north through the network of safe houses I had quietly mapped over 3 years, and hope that the distance would be enough. I could stay, face what was coming with my feet planted on Georgia soil, let the law find me standing upright rather than running. Or I could do something that I will not name here, something the darkest part of me had considered in the worst hours of the worst nights, something that once considered cannot be fully unconsidered. I sat with all 3 options the way you sit with a dying fire. Not trying to force it, just watching what remains. I thought about what Margaret would say. I thought about Samuel's jaw and Daniel's eyes. And I thought about the hundreds of men and women above me walking those fields, who would bear the consequences of whatever I chose next. I chose to stay. I released the Hargroves on the 14th day, before dawn, when the air was still cool and the plantation hadn't yet woken. I opened the crawl space myself, methodically, without theater. I helped Thomas Hargrove to his feet. And this is the part that still sits uncomfortably inside me. He could not look at me, not because of hatred, because of shame. His wife wept quietly against the wall. His children were pale and disoriented, blinking in the dim light like creatures unaccustomed to space. I did not speak. I simply stepped back and let them go up the stairs and into the house that was still theirs. Then I walked back to the smithy, sat down on the dirt floor, and waited for what I knew was coming. That decision, to stay, to face it, to refuse to disappear, told me more about who I was than anything I had ever built with my hands. I was not running. I had never been running. I had been building toward this moment my entire life. They came at mid-morning, 12 men on horseback, Colonel James Hargrove at the front, Thomas's older brother, a military man, straight-backed and deliberate, with the kind of face that had never once doubted itself. I was at the forge when they rode in, and I did not stop working. I kept my hammer moving, kept my eyes on the iron, kept my breathing even. They surrounded the smithy on all sides. I could hear the horses shifting their weight, the leather of the saddles creaking, the low murmur of men preparing themselves for something they expected to be simple. When Colonel Hargrove stepped through the doorway, the heat from the forge hit him, and he paused. Just for a half second, but I saw it. I set the hammer down slowly, turned to face him, and stood at my full height. He was a tall man. We were eye to eye. And in that moment, in that small, burning room that I had built my entire resistance inside, I watched something move across his face that I recognized immediately. It was the same thing I had seen in his brother's eyes beneath the floorboards. It was the first honest thing I had ever seen on a Hargrove. They took me that same morning, bound my hands with rope, good rope, thick, the kind used for heavy loads, and walked me out of the smithy into the full Georgia sun. Every man, woman, and child on that plantation had been brought out to watch. Hundreds of them, standing in long, quiet lines along the fence and the road, faces still and unreadable the way faces become when people have learned that expression costs too much. I walked through them slowly, and I looked at as many of them as I could, one by one, holding each gaze for just a moment. I wanted them to see that I was not broken. I wanted that image, a man walking upright with bound hands, to be the thing they carried with them after I was gone. The trial, if you can call it that, lasted less than a morning. There were no real arguments made, no evidence examined with any genuine curiosity. The verdict had been decided before I ever entered the room. I was sentenced to hang within the week. I listened to the sentence read aloud, and I felt, beneath the fear and the grief and the tremendous weight of everything unfinished, something that I can only describe as peace. I have thought many times about what I would say if I could speak to the man I was before Charleston, before the docks, before the cart, before Margaret's eyes said goodbye without words. I think I would tell him that the most radical thing a person can do inside a system designed to erase them is to refuse erasure. Not with violence necessarily, not with noise, but with precision, with memory, with the stubborn, quiet insistence that your life has architecture, that it has structure and meaning and intention, even when every force around you is dedicated to convincing you otherwise. Riverwood is gone now. The big house was torn down years ago, the fields long since grown over. My name appears in no official record that I know of, but I believe, and this is the thing I hold on to, the last true thing, that what happened beneath those oak floors left a mark that no demolition can reach. Not on the wood, not on the land, on the understanding of the men who lived it. And understanding, once it enters a person, cannot be fully removed. That is the only legacy that matters. That is the only freedom that was ever truly mine to give.